Ukraine has the ability to strike military targets in Moscow, but it is not only drones that should be launched there. Retired Ukrainian Armed Forces Colonel, pilot instructor and military expert Roman Svitan told Channel 24 about this, noting that Ukraine has already struck more than 1,000 kilometers into Russian territory, and Moscow is located much closer. As Svitan noted, already on the night of May the 5th, there was information about explosions in the Moscow region. It is quite possible that Ukrainian intelligence was determining the algorithm of the Russian air defense. Technically, Ukraine can strike Moscow's military facilities, but there is a question of speed and time. The drone flies at about 150 to 200 kilometers per hour. It is about 3 to 4 hours to Moscow, and perhaps some other maneuver will have to be done. The cruise missile goes faster, about 750 to 800 kilometers per hour. It will be possible to fly there in half an hour, but during this time the Russian air defense can work 300 times. Still, a cruise missile and a drone are fairly simple targets for air defense. Said Svitan, a ballistic missile is becoming a problem not only for Russian but for any air defense. It is an extremely difficult target to shoot down. It is almost impossible to protect Moscow from ballistics. If there were at least a dozen ballistic missiles, then 2 to 3 would definitely reach their targets, Svitan noted. Let us recall that Ukraine is working on its own ballistic missile. Recently, during the headquarters, Volodymyr Zelenski gave the task to speed up this process as much as possible. The President of Ukraine held a headquarters meeting where he heard reports on the provision of brigades and the staffing of units. The Ukrainian missile program was discussed separately, in particular the production of the corresponding weapons and existing developments. The task is to speed up the creation of our Ukrainian ballistics as much as possible. Our long-range capability is a clear and effective guarantee of security for Ukraine, he said.
The Russian army lost 1,430 soldiers and 176 units of military equipment on the front line of the war with Ukraine between May 5 and 6, according to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Russia has lost 959,500 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of its full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces reported. A total of 200 combat clashes have been recorded along the front line over the past day. Russian assault operations were concentrated on the Pokrovsk front, where 78 attacks were repelled. Ukrainian forces also repelled 18 assaults in the operational zone in Russia's Kursk Oblast. On the Kharkiv front, 4 combat clashes took place near the village of Vovchansk. On the Kupiansk front, Ukrainian forces repelled 5 attacks near the village of Zarazov, as well as towards Novosanov and Hlushkivka. On the Lyman front, Russian forces launched 31 attacks, attempting to advance near the settlements of Kharkivka, Novomykhailivka, Nov, Kolodyazy, Mern and Torsky and towards Zelina Dolina. On the Kramatorsk front, Ukrainian defenders repelled 4 attacks in the vicinity of Chasiv Yar and Kurdyamivka and towards Bila Ora. On the Toretsk front, 6 Russian attacks were recorded in the areas of Toretsk and Ozeryanivka. On the Pokrovsk front, Ukrainian defenders repelled 78 assaults near the settlements of Sukha-Baka, Stara Mykolaievka, Vodian Dru, Novodoretsk, Shevchenko, Yudakny, Uspanivka, Troitsk, Kotlyarivka, Bodanivka and Endrivka. On the Novopavlivka front, the defense forces repelled 24 Russian assaults near the settlements of Novopil, Novosilka, Priviln and Komar and towards Odradin. Russian troops also attacked Ukrainian positions 7 times near the village of Vysok on the Huliapol front. On the Siversk and Pridniprovsk fronts, the Russians did not conduct any offensive operations. In the operational zone in Russia's Kursk Oblast, Ukrainian troops repelled 18 Russian attacks. The Russians carried out 330 artillery attacks, including 8 using multiple launch rocket systems, and launched 12 airstrikes, dropping 27 guided aerial bombs. On the Volyn and Politia fronts, no signs of Russian offensive group formations have been detected. Ukrainian troops continue to inflict significant losses on Russian personnel and equipment and are actively disrupting the Russians' offensive potential in the rear.
Since the start of the war, Ukraine has destroyed up to 8,000 Russian tanks. One Russian model that has had serious problems is the T-80 main battle tank. The Ukrainians are estimated to have destroyed around 1,000 T-80s, often using FPV drones that dive-bomb the T-80's vulnerable turret, writes former US Army officer and military analyst Brent Eastwood in an article for 1945. The T-80 in Ukraine was supposed to conduct exactly these kinds of lightning attacks, but the Russians were in for a surprise. Javelin anti-tank missiles and unmanned loitering munitions did their job. In addition, the Russians remained vulnerable on the roads, long columns of tanks and armored personnel carriers slowly taking up positions. The Ukrainians simply destroyed tanks like the T-80 at the front of columns and in the rear. This slowed the initial Russian advance and created bottlenecks. An armored assault was supposed to take Kyiv early in the war, but it failed to achieve a decisive victory, and the T-80 has struggled ever since. Anti-tank missiles have also scored many hits, and the Ukrainians have effectively used both conventional artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. In Ukraine, the Russians discovered that the T-80 required a lot of fuel, and its range was reduced to only 300 miles. This undermined the tank's core concept of being used to spearhead a massive effort to punch holes in enemy front lines and create chaos deep in the rear echelons. The T-80 never made it that far, and the Ukrainians ate it alive. Like the T-72, the T-80 was initially loaded manually by the crew. Then the Russians installed a carousel autoloader inside, but it didn't help. The loading process is still slow and cumbersome. In addition, this part of the tank is not heavily armored, and one spark from a drone or an anti-tank missile can cause a fire as the shells explode. This causes the T-80's turret to jump into the air and the rest of the tank to burn. This turret toss has plagued the T-80 since the beginning of the war. Russian crews have nicknamed the tank the Steel Coffin. The invaders have deployed more than 90% of their T-80s to the battlefield. Damaged tanks are sent back to the factory repaired and upgraded to the new T-80 BVM standard, which can fire depleted uranium shells. Workers work around the clock in 3 shifts every day to build more T-80 BVMs. The BVMs are expected to have better protection against swarms of loitering drones and anti-tank missiles. But the upgrade process is slow, and new tanks barely make it to the battlefield. The Russians need to decide on tactics for using armor on the front lines. The initial lightning strike that was supposed to devastate Ukraine and allow Russian marauding forces to persuade Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenski to surrender has failed to materialize. An attempt to penetrate the enemy's trench system has failed. Drones and anti-tank missiles have taken their toll. The only thing Russia can do is to keep more T-80s in reserve and let the best T-90Ms lunge at the Ukrainians. But the T-90Ms are struggling, as are the aging T-72s. If Russia agrees to a peace deal, they will have plenty of time to evaluate the effectiveness of these tanks. They may also realize that the Soviet-era standard operating procedures have failed. They may want to reconsider attacking Ukraine again.